Okay, so sorry about that. I'll have to make it without the speaker notes, but that's fine. Yeah, as I said, I'm not an expert by any means. One of my goals is basically not to become grumpy developer who runs away from the new JavaScript frameworks. I want to sort of embrace this change, and I think like the more time I spend at this, the grumpier and grumpier someone can become. And I've definitely worked with some folks who have become so grumpy and they've moved off to do other things, or moved up in management, or moved to different roles, and they've just gotten frustrated with the change. So like, part of that is to address this. Like, how can we approach this? How can we change our attitudes? So my talk is simple. It's broken up into a few pieces. The first one is constant change is a factor in JavaScript and in philosophy, and maybe we can learn something by sort of comparing the two, and take the lessons from one and apply them to the other. That's sort of my goal. So yeah, and the second one is sort of changing your attitude to deal with that change. And then the third one is sort of advice to my younger self. And so I think it's easy for this to become super preachy and saying like, oh, I know everything now. I'm going to frame this as a sort of a humble, advice to younger me. But also it's kind of advice to my current self, because I'm still in the process of becoming a better human being, better developer. So the first one, constant change. It turns out to be like a super important recurring theme in philosophy. For today, we're kind of going to focus on older philosophies. The first one, sort of from the Western perspective, is Heraclitus, who famously said, "You cannot step twice into the same stream. Everything changes. Nothing remains still." Interestingly, a contemporary of Heraclitus is someone you may have heard of, Buddha. Nothing changes, nothing remains without change. That these are so similar to each other is kind of an interesting, not so much paradox, but it's sort of like suspicious, like someone copied the other person. It's too coincidental. There must have been some wisdom being transferred along the trade routes. But both cultures, we think of them as so separate, like East and West, but they turn out to both care about this recurring thing, that there's just constant change in the world, and how do we deal with it? It stresses us out, and this is the foundation for Buddhist philosophy. Change sort of leads to suffering, and suffering is one of the things we try to get away from in the world. We have to sort of transcend it and recognize the impermanence of the world. And so maybe in small ways we can apply that to sort of our everyday developer lives, constant framework churn, just dealing with that situation. This is something from more than a millennia later, but I thought it was interesting because it was very similar to Heraclitus as well. It's a Japanese story. The current of the flowing river does not cease, and yet the water is not the same water as before. Very similar. So, sort of pulling this back to just little old me. And so thinking back to sort of start of my career, JavaScript career, I sort of jumped into a job, started using whatever they were using there, probably was the latest framework. So I'm just going to call it Framework X for now, and it's the way of the future. It's the way of the future. This is the latest and greatest thing. This must be what the future looks like. It's not going to change much from here. This is what we're set on, right? Everything before is just total crap, and we don't need to worry about that. This is the way of the future. It's all Framework X now. And you start writing blog posts, and maybe you give some talks, and you go to meetups, and okay, you've reached expert level, okay. And then you're becoming kind of entitled at this point, probably, and arrogant, as we have want to do. I know everything about this. You should listen to me. I know what it's all about. Everything's well and dandy for a little while. You think of yourself maybe as Uber developer. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're kind of self-deceived. But then this happens. New JavaScript framework appears on the horizon. Okay, people start using it, and maybe you think, oh, this is just the latest trendy thing. This is a flash in the pan. This is going to go away. Framework X is so much better in all these ways. I don't have to pay attention to this. But people, pick it up more and more and sort of start adopting it and writing posts about it. And this is where all the new excitement is happening. Like nowadays, it seems to be like in the direction of React. Next year, probably something else. But basically, yeah, it's sort of this situation. You've probably seen this before. sort of like, oh yeah, Backbone, it's the new thing. Yeah, it's the new hotness. Oh, Angular, yeah. React, yeah. And it's just this, it's like a fashion trend. It's like, man, is this actual progress, or is it just changes in fashion and people jumping on bandwagons? And this is kind of like frustrating, because like, you start at one of these years in the past year and you've seen this all, and you're kind of like, okay, I've been through this before, like, why am I even learning this new framework? And you kind of get pissed off, and that's where the grumpy developer sort of comes in. You want to avoid that. So yeah, this is part of my perspective. This is like, okay, how can I sort of change my attitude to not be like that, to sort of be receptive to this, to be able to keep up with this? This is Heraclitus putting on his developer hat, in this case, his JavaScript hat. Technology is constantly changing. You cannot step twice into the same tech stack, which is exactly the case. It's constantly changing. People are constantly changing. Even the libraries themselves are changing over time. We saw that with Angular 1 to Angular 2, and now people got all frustrated, and everything changed. Like, why don't I just move to React now? People get frustrated with that. This is something you probably saw, Ben Nadel's blog, about AngularJS in particular. And it's kind of like an optimistic perspective. There's AngularJS 1. It's optimistic because there's still an upward trend. It's sort of like your feelings get better about the framework over time. You're sort of like, you start out with nothing at time 0. You go on, you're like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then you're like, you get frustrated with pieces of it, and you dip down into a valley, and then you go up again, you plateau, and then you're like, oh, this is really crappy. Why did they do this? But you feel like you're making progress because you're getting more comfortable with that framework. This is a good thing, right? You're making progress. But the reality is we change out frameworks so often, especially in the front-end world and the JavaScript world, that it feels to me like more like this. Like, you start out from time 0 with nothing. You go up to a certain level. You learn this framework. And then this is like over the course of years, maybe your whole career or something. And then you plateau, and then you hit a valley again, because you basically have to discard a bunch of your knowledge, and you have to be happy. You don't have to be happy with that. You have to be okay with that to be able to continue being a developer. So I would say 50% at least, maybe greater, of your knowledge that you worked so hard to acquire is just chucked out the window, and you have to be okay with that impermanence. And that's a hard thing to do. So your later career becomes, okay, maybe I'm not an expert in anything, really. I'm just going to keep my head down at my job, and hopefully they don't notice. I'll be proficient, but I'm not like Uber developer, obviously. And then later on, obviously, you switch to programming in Go, move to Florida, as Jed Smith said. And this leads into, so this constant change is recognized. I think we all agree in philosophy and in JavaScript and in the world, in our everyday lives. Constant change is just a fact of life. So the second part is our attitude towards that. So we can't control the constant change, but can we change our attitudes towards that? I think it's easier that we can change our attitudes, but it might be difficult. So I'm doing this by way of analogy. I have 2 analogies that maybe we can use our knowledge of one thing, sort of apply it to JavaScript. So how we approach one thing and apply it to another thing. So the first one is Swiss Army knives. So I'm going to say JavaScript libraries are Swiss Army knives. They're tools, they're means to an end. You pick up a Swiss Army knife, you might not have a fancy one, but you use it as means to an end. It's not an end in itself. It's not the goal to just have the library or the knife and just say, well, this is what it's all about. No, you use that, you apply that, you use it as a tool for other things. A hammer is another good analogy, but I like Swiss Army knife because it has some tools on there that you use and some other things that you probably don't use, and you might not even know what they are, but that's okay, And then the new library comes out. It's got more features. It's got different features. It's got a magnifying glass. That's pretty cool. It's got like a little hook thing that you don't even know what that is for, really. Is it for fishing? I don't know. You got a corkscrew still. But it's basically still a tool. It's like your old tool, but it's slightly different. You got some scissors on there. But, it's still a means to an end. And these are like libraries because they're kind of smaller and everything. And then you might have this monstrosity. This is like the Uber Swiss Army knife that's totally impractical. Can you even take this hiking or anything? It has clippers, like nail clippers on it. Like, how do you even use that? You put it on the desk or something, and then, I don't know, you have to get assistance for that. Yeah, frameworks are kind of more bloated, and it's got stuff on there you probably don't really need, but hey, there it is anyway. But in any case, all these things are related. They're all tools. They're all means to an end. So we should be thinking about the end in itself, the product that we're making. So we can plug and play all these different tools, basically swap them out. But our focus shouldn't be on the tools themselves. It should be on the product. And the users don't really care. They won't really notice most of the time. So that's the takeaway from this. And it's interesting because the JavaScript library is a means to an end to building the product. And the product itself is a means to an end for the user. The user isn't using the product just because they really like using the product. They use it because they get satisfaction from it. They use it because they need to book a flight. Like, they're not going to just be obsessed about that product. Well, maybe sometimes. So essentially, the JavaScript library becomes the means to an end. It's not even like the most essential thing in the whole chain that we should be focused on. Another analogy, things you might have heard of, sand mandalas, and I kind of adapted this, or stole this a little bit from John Reisig's eulogy to why the lucky stiff from the Ruby community. Basically, this is sort of approaching JavaScript libraries and recognizing that they're impermanent and being okay with that. So sand mandalas are these things that Tibetan monks basically put together. It took some days. This is all made of sand. It's really delicate. And they've got these special tools that they're sort of grinding, and the sand is coming out. And you can check it out on video. You can look up like sand mandala, construction and destruction. Destruction is the second point, and that's sort of the more interesting part of this. Right after they finish building it, they destroy it. Like, okay, what's the point then? You know, like, it's so ephemeral. It only lasts for a few days, and now it's gone. Like, you know, we have a tendency to want to preserve it. Like, you know, I think in the Western world we would say, oh, you should put some like glass over that, or put some glue over that so the sand doesn't shift around. Or we have a tendency to want to hold on to things, and we're not okay with sort of like letting things go. We have a tendency to sort of want to accumulate, preserve it, hang it on the wall, you know, and you got this whole massive fortune that you've built up over time. And that's sort of your goal of life, is preserve all those things you come in contact with. But this philosophy is quite different from that. It's sort of like, hey, you know, life is impermanent. You know, you gotta come to terms with that sometime. So this is an exercise in impermanence and being comfortable with that. And that exactly turns out to be the life of the developer, because they construct this framework, and you may be like an author on that library, but you have to recognize that thing isn't going to be around for forever. You know, it's like a few years, I don't know, a decade if you're lucky. You know, not even a decade really. But you have to be okay with that. And I think we can get help from a Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, on this point. Of all things are in our power, of things, some are in our power, and others are not. Of a harsh appearance, if a harsh appearance relates to anything which is not in our power, be ready to say it that does not concern you. I don't know why concern it looks like that, but anyway, you get the point. So there's things that are in our control, some things that are not in our control. If we should be worried about one or the other, we should be worried about things that we can control, because we can fix it and we can make it better. So we can't control the churn of JavaScript frameworks and libraries. So we put on the developer hat. We do not have control over JavaScript frameworks changing, but we have control of our attitudes towards them changing, and that's the key thing. Now this is obviously easier said than done. We can say, oh yeah, I'm in control of my attitude, but this turns out to be super hard, and this actually is like the starting point of all of the Stoic philosophy endeavor, is recognizing this point and then trying to address it, trying to control your attitude towards it. So both of these analogies sort of give us these points. They embrace the constant change and impermanence, that's the sand mandalas, and control our attitudes towards that change. That's what the Stoics started from, basically. So now we come into the last part of the talk, so it's a short talk. Advice to my younger self. Keeping in mind, this isn't just to my younger self, actually. Don't get too attached to your favorite JavaScript framework. It's not going to be around forever, but become proficient in it and be able to use it. It's a tool that you have to employ as a means to an end, so get comfortable with it, but be ready to let it go when the next thing comes along. Something that's been said over and over again, focus on vanilla JavaScript, basically because it changes less than the JavaScript frameworks. Although JavaScript is changing a lot very recently, but it does change at a slower pace than those frameworks, and that's sort of built into the core library. If JavaScript is the language you're using, you should get comfortable with sort of framework-less JavaScript. And in general, get comfortable with languages in general, because maybe you're not going to use JavaScript tomorrow. Maybe you're going to use something else. So that sort of is an extension of that philosophy. Don't despair over the JavaScript landscape constantly changing. Actually, it's kind of an exciting thing. You knew what you're getting into when you got into this career, because everyone sort of said, it changes too much, I can't deal with it. But people said, well, this is part of what's the excitement about, being a front-end developer. It's like you're constantly learning new things. You never get bored with it. But you're okay with that, you sign up for that. And when you actually experience that, you're like, this kind of sucks, Like, you have to ditch like 50% of my knowledge, like every year or a couple years or so. That kind of, like actually experiencing that is kind of a pain in the butt. So, but don't despair over it as much as you can. Try not to despair. Like I said, easier said than done, but yeah. Be ready to throw away large chunks of knowledge, as I said. Be more humble. You're not Uber developer, unless you're special. Maybe you are Uber developer, but I'm not. So I think just over time, with more experience, you kind of become more humble naturally. I see this happen with developers a lot over time. Like, when they're younger, they start out, and it's kind of cool. It's exciting. It's new, and they become very confident, which is okay. And then you learn, like, man, I don't know as much as I thought I knew, and that is like, yeah, that's very true of philosophy in general too. Sort of, you start with like a sophomoric view of the world, and then you learn, crap, I don't know nothing. I don't know grammar. Be selective about applying old knowledge. So, yeah, we have to ditch a lot of old knowledge, but we do get to keep some of it. Like the principles and things like that can be applied generally. We have that experience, and we're not throwing away all our knowledge when new stuff comes out. But we have to be selective. So this happens a lot when you come into a new job, and you're like, I want to use everything I used to use at my old job. So it's like, but we're not even using the same framework or library, And like, you have to be really selective, or you're going to piss off your coworkers too. You're like, well, at my old job, we use, MooTools, and this function is essentially the same as that. But MooTools was a little faster, and no one wants to hear that. It's just annoying. So you have to sort of be selective with that. There's still useful stuff that obviously, but not all of that is going to be useful. Not all of your experience is still useful. So think twice before you give advice with that. And this is something that came out from a talk yesterday, from Aaron Quint's talk, which was awesome, by the way. If you didn't get a chance to see it, watch it online when they post it. It's definitely worth seeing. And it's very similar to this talk, I think, but he does a very good job with it. Build cool things with blank. Choose your tool and just build the thing. Be concerned with the thing itself, like the end, not the means to an end. So just pick up the hammer or the Swiss Army knife, start building stuff, and put it down. Put it down at the end of the day. Be proud of what you've made, basically. And then, yeah, this is kind of what I was implying before. This isn't actually advice to my younger self. This is advice to my current self too. So I haven't really perfected how to get to these points. I've convinced myself of these things, but I don't necessarily know how to get to them. So hopefully, maybe that helps you too. But I don't know the way to get to feel all these things. Like, I can convince myself, okay, I need to have this kind of attitude like that. But like, actually doing it and actually having the experience of doing that is a different thing. So maybe that's, for everyone else to work out. I think the good thing that came out of this is I realized, actually, as you get that experience, your life competency kind of goes up. Whereas sort of like the JavaScript competency level kind of was a sine wave over time, and it felt like you weren't really making general progress, which is kind of pessimistic, crappy view of looking at things, but it's kind of how I feel a lot of the time. You get better at life. You get better at being a human being over time. And actually, that's the thing that turns out to matter, I think. Because you could use your life experience in other things other than programming, and life is more about programming, obviously. So if you just spaced out or whatever, that's cool. I'm cool with that. But like, here's a too long didn't watch, like a too long didn't read. Change is constant. It's uncontrollable. Because it's uncontrollable, I need to shape my attitude to accept things. And that better attitude can make me a better human. And I think better humans make better developers. Just by virtue of the fact, at least, that they're better coworkers. I want to work with good, well-rounded human beings. So I think that working on ourselves and our attitudes can make us better coworkers, and in that sense, make us better developers. If that's what we want to become, I think that's an essential piece. Maybe it's not sufficient, but it's necessary for that. And I just threw this in there at the end. Hello is other browsers. It has nothing really to do with anything. But yeah, this is from PPK's blog. PPK is an old-time JavaScript developer, if you haven't read his blog. So he obsessively tracks, all the differences between browsers. I think he still does, and mobile browsers more nowadays. But yeah, I thought it was funny. So yeah, if you want to check out the slides or reach me on Twitter, yeah. Thanks for watching. That's about all I have.